Thank you. As Junior said, I used to be the former director of the App Store, senior director, started from the ground up. But let me tell you a bit about my history. First of all, I was born in Cupertino, California. Now, Cupertino is the birthplace of Apple, and obviously Google's right down the road as well. I was born there. My father was a lifer at IBM. In fact, when I was young, I was 16, I bought my first computer. It was an Apple II. And my father found out, came home, packaged it all up, and returned it. He said I needed an IBM PC. And that was the beginning of my obsession with Apple products. So I've been in the industry 32 years. I worked at a bunch of startups. My very first company was Symantec when it was a startup. I was employee number 30 there, and employee number 30 again at Palm many years later. But the idea of mobile computing was kind of always in my blood. It's something that I really enjoyed. And so I spent a lot of time doing that, and in 2008, I quit a startup I was at, Numenta, in order to start developing on iOS. Now, in 2008, as you know, when the App Store first came out, I submitted a lot of apps, and they weren't very good apps. So they were all summarily rejected by Apple. How many people have had apps rejected by Apple in the iOS App Store, right? Pretty much everybody. My apps were rejected, and they were rejected with no mercy at all. It was some of the most painful rejections that I've ever received in my life, and that's asking girls out and other things like that. These were the worst. So I started complaining, right? I started writing a lot of notes to Apple. I started explaining how they could improve their process, things that they could do better. If you're rejected, anybody have apps rejected in 2008? I know it was a long time ago, but it was painful. And they threw a lot of legalese at you. It's much better today. It's not perfect. It's much better today. So I started complaining a lot to Apple, and I feel I was nickel and dimed every time I had an app rejected. So it's kind of like somebody reviewing your CV, and they go through, and when they find the first error, they return it to you and say, you're missing a spelling error. You have a spelling error here. You're missing punctuation. And so you'd resubmit it, and they'd go to the next line, and they'd reject it again for other issues, rather than doing a complete review in the first place. And this was some of the stuff that just drove me crazy. This was one of the things this is how I felt every day dealing with Apple. And so I kept writing, I kept complaining and trying to get things fixed. And in 2009, I started working at Apple in order to head up the App Store. So I was the first one brought on whose job primarily was App Store focused. And that's what I'm here to talk to you guys about. Some of the things I learned in building the biggest app store in the world. The very first thing I have to say is communicate your intent. In 2008, we only had a program license agreement, the PLA. And if you've ever read that, the PLA, it's just a legal document, and it's really difficult to read for many people. And it was neither specific nor complete. The PLA was one of these things that wanted to be able to tell you some of the things you could do, some of the things you couldn't do, but the rest of it was absolutely gray. And the email responses that we would reject people with were just snippets from the PLA, a lot of information there that people just found extremely onerous and difficult. But it all started with this. This is the slide that I was given when I joined Apple, and they said, okay, here are the guidelines. Now, if you can read it, it says illegal, malicious, porn, privacy, and bandwidth hog, and then my favorite, unforeseen. Now, the unforeseen was one of these that I got involved in a lot early on when I was writing apps, because they're like, hey, we've never seen an app like this, we'll reject it. So whenever there was new technology, new interesting things that people wanted to do, the app review's position was, well, it's something we haven't seen before, let's reject it. Really bad. But we ultimately went to this. Ton of guidelines. There's over 175 guidelines right now in the Apple App Store, and that is a problem. With each release of iOS, there was new things to add. When we added the Mac, when we added the iPad, when we added the Watch, Apple TV, we just kept heaping new guidelines on. Somebody said earlier that every time Apple does a release, it's like they back up a dump truck, and they dump a ton of new APIs on you. The same is true for the App Store. When they do that, we get a whole new set of guidelines as well. The big question is, why even have guidelines? Why does Google Play have a set of guidelines? What does iOS App Store have a set of guidelines. And the problem is, there are three rules, the three key reasons. One is they want to protect their brand. This is true for Google and Apple. Apple wants to protect their brand. They don't want to do anything that might tarnish their image. Two, they want to protect the customer. Yes, I said two. The very first rule, protect Apple's brand. Number two is the safety of the customers. And number three is they want to get their money, right? They want the 30%. Everybody always wants their piece of the pie. And that's the main reason why you have the guidelines, is that those three pieces. But one of the fourth is this unforeseen thing. We keep talking about unforeseen. And so early on, we didn't know what to expect in the App Store. And so we started looking at different apps. And one app came along called Baby Shaker. Does anybody remember the Baby Shaker drama? It was a long time ago. This was 2009. And all it was, it's a simple app where the baby starts to cry, right? You load it, you have a cute image of a baby, and the baby starts to cry, and so you gently rock your phone, just casually. If you shake it, this happens. Now, it seems silly, but this app was seen by 3 different reviewers on the app review team and was approved and put onto the store. Now, it was put on the store the day before we announced earnings. Apple had record earnings through the roof. It was the first time Apple had earnings like this in a long time. There were $1 million paid out to developers. Now, this was early 2009. The App Store had been open for a few months, and over $1 million were paid out to developers. So this was kind of big news. And the last thing was this app hit. And so all the news that came out seemed like it would be big, and Apple stock would skyrocket based on this. But this app came out, and within a day, the baby shaken syndrome folks were outside of Infinite Loop at Apple campus picketing, and our stock went down. So this was kind of the thing that showed people in the company how important apps were to the company, how important apps were to the media and what people wanted to do. This app being approved, I got 2 phone calls that day. The first one was from Steve himself, who said I was an idiot and I hired stupid people. Right, that was number one. Number two, and this is the first time, only time this ever happened, my phone rang and it said Al Gore, his former vice president. He was on the board of Apple at the time, and he called me up to figure out what the hell I was doing to approve something like this. And this was the beginning of my life at Apple. This was only a few weeks on, and I told you I worked at 6 startups before. Apple was the hardest I've ever worked in my entire life because of things like this, unforeseen. But then what happened? We had an app called Slasher come out. Now, Slasher was a simple one. It's just this knife that comes on, and you shake it like Psycho, and it makes the Psycho noises, and occasionally blood would splatter on the knife. Steve hit the roof. This was an app that he didn't want to have anything to do with because it kind of glorified violence. And so that was another call I received. But then there was something else that came along that I had never even heard of. Anybody heard of the term glassing? It's not something big in the States, but it's apparently very big in the UK and other areas, where somebody takes a pint glass or a bottle, breaks it, and cuts people in the face with it. Terrible thing, but we had never heard it, so we approved this app, where if you're using it, and then you shake it like that, the glass breaks, and then who knows what you do with it. But this caused such an uproar in the UK and Australia that we removed it as quickly as we could. But again, this was part of the reason things like this keep coming in, and then you add something new to the guidelines. And then the big one, the gay cure. This was an app called by Exodus that said if you follow these steps, you can cure homosexuality and make people that are gay no longer gay. This was one of these things that we never in the million years thought we would see apps like this on the store. And yet, here they come. So this is one of the reasons you keep creating guidelines, is you want to do that's constantly evolving. The second point is talk to your customers. Regardless of what they have to say, one of the reasons that Apple didn't want to talk to customers early on is that they were afraid of what the customers had to say. Now, when I'm talking about customers here, I'm talking about developers, but people in this room. Apple didn't want to hear what you had to say because they were afraid of what you had to say, about how crappy the process was, how slow it was, how difficult it was to get into the store. But for me, when I joined, I thought the only way to solve this problem was and to fix this problem was to start soliciting questions from our developers. My customers were developers. And it was extremely important to do this. So my second rule that I learned from the App Store is always talk to your customers no matter how painful it's going to be. All feedback is good feedback. I always thought that my first year at Apple, I realized on my 366th straight day of working that I didn't take off a single day in the year. I didn't have a Saturday or a Sunday to myself. It was always in the office, and I thought it could never get harder. And that's the last thing you want to think, because when you look at the volume of apps, now, if you know much about the Apple App Store, is you know that every app is looked at by a human, 100%. That includes updates, that includes new apps, especially new apps. But the number just kept growing and growing and growing. Now, when I joined Apple, there were 5 people reviewing apps. And you could handle something like 700 apps a week when you had a small number, but we were always behind. If you guys submitted apps in the early days, there was a time when it took 3 weeks to review your app. That doesn't mean someone sits down at it for 3 weeks. What that means is that it takes 3 weeks for somebody to look at it, and when they do, and they reject it, it's extremely painful. But in the end, if you see, there are 80,000 apps. 80,000 apps submitted per week that people have to look at, approve, and reject, or pass on to a higher authority, which happen quite often. 40% of these tend to be, 35 to 40% are new apps. But that number obviously goes down over time as the store keeps building. The fourth is to use the stick. Now, this was something I learned at Apple. People know the carrot and the stick mentality with regards to encouraging people to do certain things. Apple believes in the stick, and they believe using the stick a lot. Now, if you don't know what I mean, when you do something wrong on the App Store, you get beaten hard with a stick. And this stick is one of either they pull your app off the store. How many people have had their apps pulled off the store? Okay, a handful of people. Sometimes they suspend your IDP membership, your enrollment, and sometimes they just terminate you altogether. This is what they do. They will beat you hard with the stick to hope that you comply. Now, the idea to me is always you should also use the carrot, right? Entice developers to do the right thing. This isn't an Apple direction. This is something that Google does pretty well. You get certain features will be more available to you as you do the right thing. In Apple's case, there could be a lot of things that they could do. They could lower the 30% to 15% if you're doing the right thing. They could have fast lane for updates, etc. But the important thing is don't just use the stick. Learn from our mistakes, as I think you need to use the carrot as well. But now my favorite thing is that I learned that developers are wily. Developers are crafty. Some of the most creative things I'd ever seen is developers trying to get their apps into the App Store. And let me cover a few of the things that happen on this process. There was an app early on called Hot Rods. Now, when you would load it, you would get all these interesting images of cars. Now, this is what we saw when it reviewed. When it was going through the review process, you saw this amazing thing. Just a bunch of images of cars. Once we approved it, the rods changed. Now, I've blurred the image, but that's male anatomy. And now, after you load the app, after it passes review, you no longer see cars. You see genitalia. And this was such a highly downloaded app for a while, and we couldn't figure out why, because every time we'd look at it in review, it was fine. But once you look at it afterwards, it was bad. So what I call this was the remote switch. So when the app would launch, it would ask the server, am I still in review? If the answer is yes, you get these. If the answer is no, you get these. The remote switch is one of these hard things to review for because we don't get people's source code. We don't know what to look for. And it just happens based on a setting that they do on their server. Number 2, we have this thing called, early on in the App Store history and the iPhone life, you didn't really have anything like, you didn't have tethering. You could not tether your laptop to your iPhone and use that because AT&T didn't allow it. The iPhone network in the early days, the AT&T network, mobile network was sketchy, to say the least. So there was no tethering, and we specifically had a clause in there that you could not create apps to tether. So developers got a little crafty, and this teething application, which they called tethering, which didn't clue in my reviewer at the time when they reviewed it, but once you ran it outside of the App Store, you got this tether button. Now, it was really confusing to us. We couldn't figure out how they were doing this because I looked at this app a bunch of times in the office, and it was fine every time. So we found out they were looking at our IP address, 18.x. So whenever any data was, when this app launched and it was spitting out data or sending questions, responses to the server, and it was an 18.x IP address, they would show this. But if we did it at home, you would get the tether button. Really smart. And then we get to this one, which was very strange. So imagine, if you will, a car on-demand app from the States, San Francisco area. They wanted to hide things from Cupertino, and maybe also hide things from regulators, but they wanted to hide things. So we got this app, and there were certain APIs that they were just never calling in review, so we never saw it. But once we ran it elsewhere, we saw that it would show new cars, or show an additional number of cars. This is how things were hidden from regulators. For us, this is how certain code, private APIs were hidden. We couldn't figure out how they did it at first. Then we found this function in live debugging the app called Is Cupertino Watching? Now, what they're literally doing is they're looking at your location, and they just assumed that anybody near Cupertino was probably not really looking for a car. They were just the app review team. Now, oddly enough, we were in Sunnyvale, which is right next door to Cupertino, but it covered us. So this is one of the interesting things. People use IP, they don't just use remote triggers and IP addresses, but location as well to determine if the app review team is watching. Now, this was one of the hottest apps. In Christmas of 2009, this was one of the hottest selling apps. Now, if you've worked with iTunes Store before, you'll notice that they shut down the store around the Christmas holidays in order to make it so we can do some maintenance on the back end. The review team is still working, but no new apps are being posted, but we're still looking at apps. But this app got submitted right before the close of the App Store. So we could not really go up and make any changes at the time. And what we ultimately did is this app just skyrocketed. PR called me and wondered why we allowed an app with nudity on the store. Of course, I was concerned. I said, what is the app? It's called Tits and Boobies. Now, Tits and Boobies, I scratched my head. It's like, well, I guess technically it could be birds. And that's exactly what it was. But all the marketing text, everywhere you saw it, it would say things like, great tit. The marketing text actually said, you've never seen more, or you've never seen such a diverse collection of boobies or tits in one place, the most beautiful tits you've ever seen. I mean, it was really cheeky marketing text, no pun intended, but it was lovely. And this app took off. But then after that, in the beginning of the year, we got hit with a flood of refund requests because the people said, we're looking for porn and we got birds. Why do you allow this in the App Store? And as you know, I mean, a funny story is that Steve was on a leave of absence when I started at Apple, and developers were submitting so much pornographic, nude content, if you will. And you know, the states are kind of prudish about nudity, and Apple's no different. So we were trying to push the envelope, and I had this chart with different pictures of nude women and men, and saying which would we allow and which wouldn't we allow. And the VP, the senior VP, who's been on stage at WWDC many times, he said to me, "Give me that document," and he checked off the ones that we would allow and scratched off the ones we didn't. And I made him sign that document because I was not going down for allowing nudity on the store. 2 weeks later, Steve came, and he said he tore up the ruling. I still have the piece of paper. He tore up the ruling and said, "We are Disney. We will never allow pornography on the store." And so things like this ended up just taking off because people thought they might get something allowed in the store, but it didn't work. We call this bait and switch. Then we all know about copycat apps, right? Copycat apps are some of the hardest things to do. And in both of these, the original is here and the copycat is there. And you see it on the Google Play Store, you see it on the iOS App Store. This is one of the hardest things to find, or hardest things to keep out of the store. Because when an app gets big, such as 2048, you see that the App Store gets loaded with these apps, 2048, and it's very difficult to protect from that. Developers want to go where it's hot, what's interesting, and now, when somebody asks me which is the best 2048 app to download, I have no idea. There's so many. The same was true with Flappy Bird. Flappy Bird was one of these apps that was so frustratingly simple. It was addictive and extremely hard to. I could get maybe 4 paces into this before I choked every time. But to me, the interesting thing about Flappy Bird is not how the app was, and how viral it was, but what happened behind the scenes. The Flappy Bird story is an amazing one. It was created by this developer from Vietnam. And some would say he ripped off these 8-bit graphics from Nintendo, et cetera. And that was part of the thing that drove people crazy about the app and why people loved it, is how simplistic it was, and as well as how it looked. But this developer created this app in, I think, 3 days, and put it out in the stores, both Google Play and iOS App Store. And it got millions of downloads right away, millions. And then somebody wrote an article about how successful this was and how much money that he's probably making. And again, this developer is from Vietnam. So this went on for a while until he got a note from the Vietnamese government saying, hey, we want to schedule a meeting with you to meet next week. Now, all he saw was they're going to take my money, right? So he fled. He disappeared. He went underground for a while. We couldn't get in touch with him. We were trying to figure out what to do because his app had disappeared for a while, but then he put it back on the store. And he ultimately got back in touch with us and told us how he disappeared for a while because the Vietnamese government was after him. And he believes it was the tax thing, but who knows? But when he came back, he saw his email inbox was flooded by complaints from users. How frustratingly difficult the app was to use, how much they hated it because it ruined their life because they couldn't get past a certain level. And he had so much guilt on this, he ended up yanking the apps from both stores, from iOS and App Store. Just an interesting story of how success can absolutely crush somebody, and that happened really quickly to him. Here's one of the interesting things that's happening a lot nowadays, rating and review fraud. So imagine a developer comes along and he wants to create a great next new shopping app or something like that. Let's say it's a e-commerce app that's really kind of cool. But he's not getting many people to download it. So he hires this marketing firm that creates a bot that downloads it thousands of times. Now, if you know on these systems, if you need to download them, or if you want to review them, you have to create an account. So these bots create. One of these bots that I remember specifically created 10,000 accounts in this rural Alaska town that nobody lives in. Created thousands and thousands of accounts, and all it did was download and rate the apps. That's all it did. Now, they were free apps. And so once we discovered this developer got terminated. Now, not he didn't die. I mean, obviously, we just removed him from the program. But he got terminated from the program because we could tell he hired this marketing firm to just arbitrarily download, it's this review and rating fraud. Now, this happens all the time. But the new twist that developers put on this, developers now know if they hire a marketing firm, they're going to get terminated. Right? That's pretty. If they hire a marketing firm that does these type of shenanigans, they will get terminated from the IDP. So you know what they're doing now? They're hiring marketing firms to market their competitors' apps to get them terminated, and it works. It works because when I work with the fraud team, you try to. The last question you ask, you're like, okay, the developer says a competitor did this. And the fraud team's like, how are we supposed to know who does this? All we know is it's bad. This is one of the craziest things that we see a lot. I'm not suggesting anyone do it, I'm just pointing it out. And now one of the big things is malware. Apple was hit by a malware a few years back, a malware issue that is curious. But the question is, in something like, and Google, obviously, I mean, with 700,000 apps that Google Play and Protect took off the store this past year, it's phenomenal how much malware is out there and what people are doing to get around the review processes and just to I don't know, try to steal data from our customers. In this case, it was really interesting. If you know much about Xcode comes bundled as a package, and it has a bunch of libraries that people use to build, like kernel and system, et cetera, and security. So imagine if a malware developer were to download Xcode and start tweaking it. Start tweaking the media libraries, different APIs, kernel, the security, putting in code there to get information off your users' devices. And then you build an app with this. Now, you don't know it's in violation. If they bundle it back up and put it into a distribution somewhere online, people will download it, and they'll use that as a way to start building their apps. And as soon as you start building apps, it will affect everything. You will just see it go, and malware will spread through the stores. Let me go back really fast. Malware will spread through the store. Now, the reason this happened to Apple in this case was because the Xcode is a huge bundle to download. And people in China at the time were finding that the pipe to download Xcode from Cupertino was too massive, and it was taking far too long. So they found a new server that was hosting Xcode up in China, and it was a fast download. They could get all the information they wanted. So everybody was downloading with that, and thousands and thousands and thousands of apps were developed with this malware, with this infected version of Xcode. And all those apps were submitted to the store. And so Apple had to go through and remove every one of them, alert developers that they need to resubmit, and so they were white-gloved in. But Apple even sent an email to all the customers that downloaded one of these apps to alert them to this and said you need to update your apps as quickly as possible. If a developer couldn't update, because Apple doesn't have a remote way to remove an app from a user's device. So if an app is pulled off the store, it's not pulled off your device, it's just pulled off the store. So we had to go out to customers and urge them to download the newest version. Now, if a developer didn't write a newest version, let's say this one, the developer's like, no, I'm done with that app. We encouraged them to, but ultimately there was nothing we could do. So there are people still around with a version of the app, maybe with malware on their phone. They've received an email, but there's not much they can do. This is some of the most interesting stuff that's happening on iOS and Google Play right now. And trying to figure out how to squash this is a tough one. But like I always say, developers are wily, and if we just put our heads together, we can pretty much solve anything. Perception is everything. This is one of these points that I like to make out. The world needs developers to continually push the envelope. Apple is a little closed off to innovation from developers. They don't often push the envelope as much as developers like to, and we've seen that through the app stores. And so my statement here, the main point I want to get across, is if you have something that's really compelling, and Apple keeps rejecting it, don't just go silent into the night. Complain. Do an appeal. Complain. Use whatever you can, whatever means necessary to get your point out there. The iOS guidelines are really gray. They're very subjective. And if you have a chance to change the world, get Apple to approve your app, and you can do that in many ways. The photo here is all about the media, and Apple responds well to the media. If you go and you put a nice campaign together and you say this app should be approved for these reasons, and you go to the media and you talk to them about it, odds are Apple will ultimately approve it. I'll tell you a story what happened early on in the cryptocurrency space in the App Store. There was early on, we did not allow any sort of cryptocurrency apps on the store. One company, the most popular exchange in the world, they submitted an app that had an Easter egg in it that when you entered the code, It gave wallet functionality, stuff that was that was explicitly prohibited in the App Store. And of course, we terminated them because the only way for them to get this information out to their customers is to write a blog post. And they wrote a blog post that told us how to find this Easter egg, so we found it and terminated them. Now, it was painful for that company, we know that, just because they were trying to get a functionality that I personally felt was perfectly valid. So what happened? Well, we terminated this developer, but the cryptocurrency in general, the cryptocurrency world in general, went a little nuts and came hard at Apple. And one user actually posted a video of him destroying his iPhone with a high-powered rifle, and it went viral. And from the day I saw it to the day we approved cryptocurrency apps, it was less than 12 hours, literally less than 12 hours. So the way to Apple's heart is to show that people are going to stop buying phones if something isn't pushed. Media does help. The first set of the guidelines, if you ever read them, there was specifically a clause in there in the preamble that said, don't go to the media, it doesn't help. But I can assure you, it helps. Always helps. Now, this is my last piece of advice, and it's one that we should all adhere to, this is one of the biggest lessons I learned at the App Store, and it's a simple one, and it's never trust a magician. It's kind of interesting. This is David Copperfield. I don't know if you know who he is, but he had an app early on in the App Store, and it kept getting rejected, because it seemed all it was trying to do was trick people. And, right? He's a magician. What do you expect? And so we kept rejecting, my team kept rejecting this app. And when I came on board, I heard about it, and it's like, let me take a look at it. Now, if you know anything about Apple's history, is they're super secret, right? So when I joined, I was explicitly told nobody can ever know who you are, right? As long as you work here, people can't know your name because they'll hunt you down, they'll find you. And oddly enough, that did come true, but I never told anyone what I did. But of course, I had to talk to developers. And this was one of the developers I spoke to and gave them information, ultimately approved their app. And so what's the first thing this magician does? He outs me on social media and says, thank you, Phillip Shoemaker, for approving my app. He's the head of the App Store, blah, blah, blah. And the rest was history. I was only there for a few months when this happened, and my life was turned upside down because this magician outed me. And we have a lot of interesting things going on in the App Store as far as once people know who you are, things happen. I had death threats. I had multiple people sitting in the lobby with pictures of me, waiting for me to walk by. And the receptionist would always call me up and say, Phillip, there's somebody here with a picture of you again. It's like, okay, I won't go out that door anymore. We had Apple security found a few people tailgating, and that's when they sneak in on somebody else's badge to try to sneak into the office, trying to find my office to have a conversation with me. But what Apple security would do is they would bring them back out to their car, walk them out to their car, and send them on their way, but not before taking pictures of all the contents of their car, taking pictures of their identification, and then they send it to me in an email like I'm going to do something with it. I don't know what to do with this information. But here's the thing here is that I make light of never trust a magician, but as far as the App Store was concerned, this was probably one of the better things that happened. Because even though my life was hell for a few months and I was dragged through the mud, what ultimately happened is it sparked a conversation with many developers and myself, and we were able to change the process and change a lot of the way we handle a lot of things in the App Store. And this all goes back to one of the earlier points, which is you always have to talk to your customers, and you have to be open with them, and you have to ensure that you're doing things in their best interest in addition to your own. You have to understand what they're going through, and you have to look at their perspective. And so I will leave you with that. Thank you very much. My name is Phillip Shoemaker. If anybody wants to have a conversation with me, feel free to pull me aside. And that's it. Thank you very much.